Can everyone see okay? Yeah. I haven't got my glasses, but I know his name is Carwyn Graves, and I'm Ben Rawlins, and I'm the director of Black Mountains College, and it's my great pleasure that Carwyn has come from across from Lampeter to join us today. As you may know, BMC is here in Talgarth. We're holding these talks once a month, thanks to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and they are all on the subject of the ecological imagination, inspiring our imagination for the changes and the alternative ways of doing things that we all know is necessary. So, Carwyn has written a terrific book called Tyr, The Story of the Welsh Landscape, which he's going to talk about this evening. It's published today. And you can get your signed copies afterwards, hot off the press. This is Carwyn's third book, I believe. His previous publishing record was mostly inspired by apples and food. And he has been doing some teaching at University of Wales, Trinity St David's, as well as working at your own farm, I believe.
No.
No, I got that bit wrong. Anyway, I'll let Carwyn speak for himself. Sovereign Messer and Adrian are providing drinks, so please do have a drink afterwards. We'll have about 40 minutes of talk, and then we've got around just under an hour for questions and conversation afterwards. Over to you, Carwyn.
Great. Diolch yn fawr, thank you. I should correct myself. I do have my own farm. It's a suburban back garden on the outskirts of Carmarthen. Diolch. It's good to be here with you all this evening. Before going any further, I like to find out who I'm talking to. So I'm going to get you to tell me a bit about yourselves. The only thing I know is that you're here in Talgarth this evening and what I can see looking. So some of you here are associated with Black Mountains College, I know that, and others are presumably local. Faint o'ch chi fan hyn sy'n deall Cymraeg? Os fi'n siarad yn Gymraeg, mae 'na rai yn siarad Cymraeg? Yeah, so some people understand Welsh. How many of you would class yourselves as local to Talgarth? You could define that, but okay, helpful. How many of you are interested in history? Oh, almost everyone, that's good. Any farmers in the room? Yeah, you can define what that means. Yeah, great, thank you. Anybody here like gardening? Into gardening? Yeah, quite a lot. Yeah. What about cooking and food? Okay. Has anybody not put their hand up at all yet? No, we're fine. Good. Okay. Because I'd have to work quite hard otherwise. Good. Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I did know that it was publication date when the invitation came through, and I thought, we're better to come. Not least because the map that pleasingly is on the wall over there of Talgarth as an orchard town, as I call it in the book, is reproduced in the colour plates in the middle. So I thought it was fittingly poetic to have that invitation come through. We've had the previous things mentioned. Why come to write this? Actually, there is a golden thread that I think Ben alluded to between the three books. It is about apples and orchards. There is nothing better in the world, and everything else is simply a sort of extrapolation from that. I'm exaggerating a little bit. But I think they do exemplify the underlying point and argument in all three books really well, and hopefully that will become clear by the end of the next, what did you say, 2 hours? This book I started writing over 3 years ago, and at the time things were already relatively polarized when it came to the questions of land use, and then farming, ecology, which are often pitted as two extremes on the same spectrum. So I thought I could write it without addressing any of that. And the more I wrote, the more I realized that would be impossible. But what I want to say before going any further is that the starting point for the book is the idea, which I think is incontrovertible today, that farming and nature are both massively under threat in Wales. I think that's uncontroversial. I think it's the right starting point. It was at least my starting point. And it felt like maybe a helpful place to begin, not least to deal with my own nervousness in writing about this and in knowing that people would pick it apart and maybe shoot holes and maybe shoot me down as well. And yeah, we'll see how I address that as we go further on. But before we do that, I want, that picture's up there on purpose, and I wanted to get you thinking about where you're coming from. We've all got stories, experiences, backgrounds that we bring to bear to these questions. So let me ask you in a moment to turn to the person next to you, or in a group of three or whatever works, and start answering that question. Can you come up for me with two, maybe three words that for you capture your relationship with this land of Wales? Before you do that, I'm going to give you 30 seconds of silence to think about it, and then I'm going to get you to turn, and then we'll kind of feed back to the room. So just 20 seconds of silence. What's your relationship with this land of Wales? Close your eyes if you like. Okay, turn to the person next to you and have a chat about it. Share. Be there, but feel free to continue those conversations afterwards. Can somebody just shout out to me something that you shared? A word. Home. Hiraeth. Thank you. Something else. Rescue. Waterfalls. Thank you. Cowl. Was that cowl? Cold. Glaw. Cold glaw. Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah. Food. Thank you. Trees. Light. Belonging. Spiritual. Thank you. Love.
The biodiversity we've lost.
Biodiversity. That's not a word. I'm pulling your leg. Somebody over here? Richness and? Soothing. Belonging. Thank you. Despoiled. Okay. I'm going to cut across you there. Great. Thank you. That's really helpful. I think we've started touching on these two phrases, haven't we, with your words, and much else besides. But I mean, that's a picture from this county. I won't tell you exactly where it is, but it is in mid Wales. And on the one hand, we live, do we not, in a natural paradise. On the other hand, we live in a blasted, despoiled landscape. That's important. It's important to acknowledge both, I think. I'm going to read from the book at this point, because I think it sets the scene. Understanding the tale of the Welsh landscape is no easy task. Differing stories about the landscape run deep, and for centuries have led to controversies of one sort or another. In many ways, the Wales of today is a blasted landscape, industrialised and polluted earlier than any other Western society. Racked by bad management and corporate power, it is now one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Reference, footnote. The Welsh landscape has also been despoiled in myriad ways by its governing authorities, resulting in everything from zombie conifer plantations to dead rivers and sheep-wrecked hills. The beautiful stone farmhouse at Cwm yr Arian, which is what I opened the book with, an old orchard that's been abandoned, now lies ruined, the people gone, while the orchard it once supported has not only been neglected, but even the orcharding heritage it represents almost wiped from memory and the historical record, a symptom of a wider malaise. But this small landscape that covers only 8% of the UK's land area is enormously diverse in composition and contains in microcosm almost all the different sorts of habitat and terrain that exist across the British Isles. Astonishingly, with 1,467 out of a total of 1,727 species, Wales has representatives of almost all the plant species present across the island of Great Britain as a whole. Given how much further north Scotland extends and how much nearer to the continent much of England lies, this Welsh number is surprisingly high and betrays the range of geologies and microclimates that makes Wales Wales. Such biological diversity may also reveal something about Wales's land use history, reflected also in the at first glance surprising fact that Wales has more than 20 times as much ancient woodland as nearby Ireland, and may have as much as the whole of France. But whatever may be said about this profusion of plants and land use history, there's clearly also an important riddle to be solved related to what has happened to this landscape over the past century or so of Cwmar Arian's decline. I should explain, Cwmar Arian lies near the Towey River, south of Carmarthen towards the sea. It's no longer a farm, it's been amalgamated into another holding, but it was known locally as one of the best, most productive farms, and of course, there were 15 people living and working there, 100 years ago. Despite the fact that there were fewer trees, smaller woodlands, and a lot more industrial pollution in 1910, say, than now, overall levels of biodiversity as measured by bird and insect life were substantially higher. Over a quarter of Wales's land area is protected either as national park or area of outstanding natural beauty, and well over 10% of the land is designated as belonging to SSSIs, sites of special scientific interest. All these have come into existence over the course of the last 70 years, but the decline in wildlife has only accelerated over this period. The countryside now contains substantially less nature and substantially fewer working people than it did a century ago. To everyone I have spoken to in the Welsh countryside, both these things feel like profound failures. What has happened here? The broad contours of what has gone wrong may well feel familiar thanks to accelerating climate change and the slow death of the natural world more broadly. But as one of the first industrialized societies, understanding the specifics of what has happened to the Welsh landscape may well help bring out wider principles. Getting under the skin of both the death of some parts of the Welsh landscape and the reasons why other parts have remained in comparatively good health seems like an important question to ask in the early 2020s. Musing on this question, it seemed increasingly clear to me as well that there was an important aspect to it that had hardly been touched upon in English, namely the cultural attitude towards the land and landscape contained and expressed within Welsh culture. The second verse of the Welsh national anthem, reproduced above, may well at first glance reflect mid-Victorian romantic sensibilities, but scratch deeper at both this and the wider corpus of Welsh culture, and you will find an attitude towards the land that differs in notable ways from that of the dominant European cultures, whether English, French, German, or others. Je dis ça en tant que personne qui parle français couramment, etc., etc. I'm quite familiar with these cultures, and I can substantiate that assertion in ways I don't have space to do in the book. This attitude, I think, is an important part of the story of the Welsh landscape as it has developed, and I wanted an account of it to be a central part of the mix as I explored its human and ecological history. I'll stop reading there and talk a little bit more, share a little bit more on what I'm on about. I should explain at this point maybe a little bit more about who I am. I mean, this will come through, I suppose, in different places, but my first language is Welsh. That's what we speak at home all the time. I've got 2 young kids. Miriam is 6, Arthur is just turned 4 the other day. So, church and school and friends and everything, all in Welsh. Natural as breathing. I appreciate that hasn't been the case around here for more than living memory now. Where I live in rural Carmarthenshire, it still is, although threatened. And it's interesting to look at the word culture. We go on a lot in Welsh about diwylliant. Diwylliant in a dictionary is the translation of culture, but you can break it down. Diwylliant. Di is to undo something, yeah? Wyll is gwyllt, which is wild, and then yant makes it into a noun. So in other words, you could retranslate the word culture into English from the Welsh as unwilding, right? So if you've followed the news and all of these debates in Wales for a little while, that might help understand why rewilding has seemed to many people around the Llynlleth, for instance, like an absolutely anathematic thing to try to do. Culture is unwilding in Welsh. And this is expressed in so many ways. It's hard to convey. I'll try to convey. I mean, this is still widely available in Welsh language bookshops. This is an anthology of 20th century Welsh language poetry, much of which is written by farmers. In a poetic tradition, if you're not familiar with it, poetry in Welsh doesn't mean the same as poetry in English. It's primarily a social thing. When my daughter Miriam was born, somebody in our chapel wrote an englyn to celebrate her birth. When my grandfather was 80, I was expected to write a poem to celebrate his birthday. It's a social thing. It's not to do with the poet being, tapping into some ethereal muse in an ivory tower and then expressing his inmost feelings. Unfortunately, it often has been his historically, although it's changing now. It's to do with how people relate to each other in society. That's important to say. And many of these poets have been farmers. You'll have heard, hopefully, of the National Eisteddfod. This is very, very short, 4 lines in strict meter verse from one of the poems that won the chair in the mid-50s in the Eisteddfod by a farmer from near Bala in North Wales. I don't need to find it in this because it's on there. The whole thing is an awdl, which you could mistranslate as ode, but it's long, it's pages and pages and pages. This little one, this little, 4-line section, I'll read it to you and then I'll translate it loosely. Ac yw'r neb o'i febyd, fi'n gymar i'r ddeiar werdd ddiwyd, y gŵr a arddor gwerid, a heofais, gwyn ei fyd. And he, the farmer here, the ploughman perhaps, is the one who from childhood has been the partner in an almost, in a relationship sense, but possibly almost sexual sense, fi'n gymar, as partner to the green, industrious earth. The man who goes to plough the face, meaning the face of the earth, and to sow a field. Blessed is he, but blessed is he, gwyn ei fyd, white his world literally. It's the same phrasing that Jesus uses in the Beatitudes. Blessed are you, blessed are you. And it goes on and on and on, and then and it talks about the cycle of the seasons, and then it changes, and the next bit of the poem is written in the voice of the earth. The voice of the earth praising the work of people, alongside nature, effectively. And then there's a third part, which is the voice of the angels. Fine. That's one example. I could talk about Dick Jones, who was the Archdruid of Wales, also wrote many long odes, was a farmer near Aberporth, died 10 years ago. And he has many similar poems, and in them he talks about dead sheep and about the hard physical labour and the cycle of the seasons and what that means in terms of life and death on a farm and in terms of the natural world. My point here is that an intimate understanding of farming cycles as they used to exist is embedded within the mainstream of, well, in particular, Welsh language culture. So let me repeat that. Farming cycles as they used to exist, mixed farming, a sort of farming that has become increasingly marginal and the very last vestiges of which are now finally dying in Wales, sadly, but may yet come back, embedded. And I've put a little question, a little phrase at the bottom here. Before I come on to that, this picture. That is from the Llŷn Peninsula. That picture was taken, I forget the exact date, but it's in the book, but it was taken in the 60s, I think it's 1965. So it's a working horse, you've got the flock of fowls in the fields. If you've got good eyesight, you'll see just behind. In the fields on the hillside, you've got those stucks, we call them, the ricks, aren't they, in English, yeah. And I don't know how I managed to write a book in English, anyway. And all of, many of these details are things from a farming life that are now gone, but are absolutely within living memory still, right? Mid-60s in many parts of Wales, particularly, I think, on the western side of the country. And so here's the thing. I found it jarring, increasingly so, to listen to programs, to read books, to hear various things in the media and so on, talks and so on, dealing with, the ecological crisis that we face on all the different levels that I'm sure you're aware of, and then thinkers who I admire coming to the conclusion, well, we have these problems, and it's because in our modern Western society, we don't know what it is to be native to place. We need to become indigenous again. And I could understand where these people were coming from, but it was also discombobulating to read that, to hear that, because from the background that I have, and in many ways the world that I live in, that's also the starting point. And I think a lot of this is real relevance, both to the future and to understanding the relationship that people in Wales in the countryside have had with the land. Let me exemplify that with just a few cameos. The first one is Tros. It's difficult to translate Tros into English. You might call it heath, but it's not actually, as a sort of, ecological space, it's not heath at all, and not like lowland heath, London, England, or whatever. Moor doesn't really work. The best translation would probably be something like waste, but we don't say waste in English anymore. But there's a lot of rhostir around the place, a lot less than there was, but it's still there. Sometimes you see it in place names that have been anglicised, like Rws, where the airport is down near Cardiff. What is the horse? That is, the picture doesn't come out very well. If you go through areas of horse, it's a sort of yellow-brown colour most of the year. It's rough grazing. It's poorer land. It's not very well drained. It's not very productive land. And within living memory, there used to be an awful lot of it. Why was it there? Why was it there? It very much had a function within the farming system. It's only because it's lost that function that we've lost the eco-space that it represents over more or less living memory to a great extent. What used to be, I want to draw various threads together. What used to be present on the land? Well, for one thing, it was summer grazing, and it was really important summer grazing. to the extent that huge battles were fought over Rhostir. The best example of this is in a place called Mynydd Bach in the middle of Ceredigion. If you go to Aberaeron, if you know where Aberaeron is on the coast, and you go inland, and you get to where the trees get stunted and the growth gets worse, and you keep going up to where to where it's raining when it's probably sunny in Aberaeron, and everything looks incredibly bleak, then you're on Mynydd Bach. Mynydd Bach was the site of really massive pitched battles, but even including dragoons, more or less 200 years ago to now. The reason for this was that the whole place, Mynydd Bach, you could translate as Little Mountain, but it means a lot more than that. But anyway, no time for that. Mynydd Bach had been grazed for, since time immemorial, by everybody who lived around, cottagers and farmers, in summer, and the peat had been taken in summer, dried and used as fuel. There's a few people still doing that in Wales today, in an old tradition that goes right back. Anyway, and they thought that they had rights to that. Of course, they were wrong. Those rights had existed in Welsh law, which hadn't been effective, which were formally abolished finally in 1536 with the Acts of Union. So by the time we get to the 1820s, they're 300 years out of date, but they don't know it because they're monolingual Ceredigion smallholders and so on. So they think they're exercising their long-held rights to graze and to gather peat. Actually, the rights had gone to the Crown, in London, in Windsor. And the Crown, in this period, had started enclosing, that big word, enclosure. It means different things in different parts of the UK, and how it works in Wales is really quite different to the classic English thing in the Midlands. There, in Mynydd Bach, what happens is that the Crown effectively sells it to an aristocratic landowner. So he, entirely legally, this guy, Augustus Brackenbury, from Lincolnshire, turns up at Mynydd Bach, having bought it, and his intention is to improve the land. He, by all accounts, was quite a sincere man, and he thought that his plans would help the local smallholders and farmers. Little did he know. Unfortunately, long story short, you can read all about it in the book, but long story short, they are incensed at somebody coming and telling them they can't, carry on their customary rights anymore in the way that they used to without referring to him first. And he starts building a mansion, and they set fire to it at night, and some of it's like a fairy tale, coming in the night, and and everything that's been built in the day is taken away at night, and then they set guards, and then the garrison from Aberystwyth comes up, and then somebody goes on the hilltop with a trumpet and calls 1,000 men to lay siege to the manor house. It's fantastic, the story, and the locals win. After about 7-8 years of this, if off the top of my head now, I need to refresh myself, something like that, he just has enough. And he gives in, and the locals win. The whole episode is called, by the way, The War of the Little Englishman, and still very, very much remembered locally. But anyway, that's another matter. But here's the interesting thing. He'd set about enclosing parts of the common, and they said, this is our issue with you. They weren't being entirely they weren't being entirely genuine in saying that. They had already set about enclosing the common themselves as smallholders, building cottages and improving, draining, and so on. Really, what their issue was that he was doing it rather than that they were doing it. But because they managed to drive him out and had made such a huge stand at some cost, people went to prison and got beaten up and so on and so forth. Because they managed to drive him out, they then had made it impossible for themselves to continue enclosing. And so in order to maintain their rights of turbary and of grazing and so on in summer, they basically came to a tacit agreement not to continue enclosing, which held true for a long time afterwards, which explains some of the reasons why Mynydd Bach, for a long time after that, remained unenclosed, even to some extent to now, whereas other similar bits of poor land in Ceredigion got enclosed. But many, many, many never did, across southwest Wales and indeed other areas. And one of the people who benefited from that was my own family. So that railway carriage is where my grandfather grew up. They were too poor, bottom of the pile, socially and economically and so on and so forth. He was one of 16 children. He died a few years ago. His father, like many, many people in that part of the world, still now, the greatest aspiration in life was to be a farmer, whatever that meant. If you needed another income in order to be a farmer, fine, no problem. That's very much still true now, of course. His other income, his father, so my great-grandfather, needed to be working in the coal mines. He got silicosis. He spent 15 years lying on a bed in the railway carriage dying while the children more or less raised themselves. Anyway, there's lots that can be said. What used to be present on this land? Well, all sorts of things. I went to see my uncle Martin, who grew up there, my grandfather's brother. He's still alive. He's in his 90s. I went to see him and several times while writing and wanted to get more memories, more recollections. And Martin said to me, well, we did, talked about, adventures. Maybe I'll read. I think maybe it's here. Maybe the answer's here. Better said than I can say it ad lib. Here we are. This is a personal story for me, with the issues at stake in this chapter entwined in my own family history and forming the backdrop to many of my own happiest childhood memories. My grandfather and his many brothers and sisters grew up in the 30s and 40s on a windswept patch of Rhos in the hills on the Carmarthenshire-Pembrokeshire border. They were at the very bottom of the pile economically, owning at any one time just one set of clothes and shoes, which would be clogs. My great-grandmother, Ruth, died in childbirth when Dad Key was only 2, and he and most of his siblings were raised by their oldest sister, only a teenager at the time. Blah, 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 blah. Money was short, but like many people in that rural community, one of their highest aspirations was to work the land. In the end, they rolled an old railway cottage into the corner of a field surrounded by Rhos, only a stone's throw from a good spring that didn't run dry. There, my grandfather grew up in a life as different from my childhood in 1990s Cardiff as mine was from that of most kids my age in the global south. 3 tiny bedrooms made out of carriage compartments and 1 kitchen in which to cook, eat and dry clothes by the single stove. All vegetables homegrown on the plot's poor, yellow soil, fed by copious amounts of manure. Fowls for eggs, potatoes and goats in the field. Of course, this diet was all organic and would be very expensive these days. Only flour, sugar and tea were regularly bought in. And the radius to which life extended were the 10 miles or so it took to walk to the cobbler's hut in a wood near Gelliwen. That cobbler's hut is still there now, just rotting away. The nearest towns were known by name and hearsay only. Bananas, chocolate, and much else familiar to contemporaries of theirs living in towns and cities, or indeed richer rural areas, unknown. The place was called, ironically, Rhos Mansion. The irony heightened by the use of English in a community which census results show was among the most Welsh-speaking in the country at the time, with most neighbours monolingual Welsh. In the 1960s, when stewardship of the place passed to my grandfather, our own family name for the place changed to the more suitable Tyddyn y Rhos, or Rhos Cottage. Either way, at the time, the name was entirely apt. It was surrounded on 3 sides by scrubby heath, there we are, another attempt at the translation, extending for the best part of a mile in each direction, with just a few other real cottages, rather than railway carriages, for neighbours, also carved out of the horseland, with their garden and a small infield or two. None of this changed the fact that this was a hard life on poor ground. Their older brother, Ivor, returned to take over the tenancy in the 1950s, building a lean-to corrugated iron kitchen onto the side of the carriage and trying to make a living from the smallholding. It didn't work. The land is poor and the growing season short, even compared with areas just a few miles away and a couple of 100 metres downhill. His venture failed, and only a few years later he had to move away for work. That, ultimately, is why these areas had become rhos in the first place. As we saw in chapter 3, in every area of Wales, until changes in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the basic pattern for farming consisted of arable infields, with some permanent pasture or meadowland, complemented by large areas of summer grazing. In most areas outside the true uplands, much of this summer grazing was horse land, and the reason it became such, rather than being made into infields or meadows, was the knowledge that these areas were the worst parts of any given area. Thinner or stonier, sourer soils, sometimes stonier, sometimes wetter and boggier, and always unable to dependably give a crop of hay or grain. And then, of course, what that meant, as I went to ask Martin, was not just that there were what was on this land, a family and potatoes and chickens and goats and a community, but also he said to me, because he's in his 90s, he said, I haven't been there for years. Is the chwibanwr still there? Now, nobody my age, I don't think, in Carmarthenshire, Welsh speakers, know what chwibanwr is anymore. And they wouldn't know the Welsh name. And the chwibanwr certainly is not to be found there now. The chwibanwr is the curlew, or it is the curlew in the Carmarthenshire dialect name for it. There's much else besides the chwibanwr that used to be there that is no longer there. And even, before I move on, even 15 years ago, you could look out of those windows over the valley, and much of the landscape in front of you would be brown for half of the year, because it was rhos. For reasons that I entirely understand, that is no longer the case. The land is now green, and it's ryegrass. That has changed in the last 10 years. The Ordnance Survey map will tell you that it's common land, and that it belongs to nobody. Reality on the ground tells you something different. We are losing, the rhos is one of the biggest ecospaces that we've lost in Wales over the past century. And that's not just to do with wildlife. And I alluded to this with the rhos. Cloddiau is the name I gave another chapter. It's probably the most widespread, helpful term of the many terms in Welsh for what I tried to translate into English as hedge banks. So in some areas of Wales we have hedges, some areas we have stone walls. The interesting thing, and some areas we have something that is both, actually. And the interesting thing is that in many parts of North Wales where there's a lot of stone walls, they're called cloddiau carreg, they're called stone clawdd. What is clawdd? Clawdd is a bank, but it's also a hedge. It's both. It's this, that would be, pretty much all of Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire, Ceredigion, and many parts of Glamorganshire, Powys, and blah, 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 in summer. What's underneath half of that is this, right? Massive boulders. They're not all very, very old, but many of them are really ancient. To the best of our knowledge, some of them go back about 5,000 years. I've only been able to say that with confidence since 2020, I think it's 2020, when in Cornwall they used a new technique called, I think it's bioluminescence, I need to double check, but I think it's bioluminescence, where effectively what it means is you can take something like a massive boulder off the soil and measure, and they will basically be able to tell you how long it was since that patch of soil, if you do it immediately, how long it was since that patch of soil last saw sunlight. And they've checked it against known things, and so there's a high degree of confidence. So they've done that in parts of Cornwall. There's no good reason to think that the same doesn't hold true in many parts of Wales, where we have these sorts of hedge banks. Obviously, probably you know, they're hugely significant these days in our landscape for wildlife. But why are they there? And why have they been there for so long? The older they are, the better they are for wildlife, typically, in terms of the mixed species and everything. Why are they there? They're there because of the function that they've always had in the farming systems. It's obvious, but it bears saying. And not just in farming systems. We could drill into much more detail around that. Because those farming systems have always been mixed farming systems, dependent on nutrient cycling. So rather than bringing outside nutrients onto the farm, cycling the nutrients that are in the landscape already, primarily via the use of animals. To some of you, this is going to sound incredibly technical and boring. Others of you know all this already. But it's important. They're there because the agricultural economy in Wales, despite the nonsense that you read in some books will tell you that until the sort of Elizabethan or late medieval period, Wales was a tribal country which was basically pastoral and people moved around with their flocks. It's utter nonsense. The landscape has been settled since, in a comparable way to now, since the early Bronze Age. And that's not controversial. And the main thing that's always kept people alive in that landscape has been arable crops. And the fertility of the arable crops has come from the animals. So you really need to carefully control where the animals are, protect the crops, protect the meadows. And the easiest way to do that, where there's plenty of stone and where, some species will grow very quickly, is something like this. That's why they're there. So that question, who benefits from these being there? Well, again, it's that, I'm belaboring the point, aren't I? But wildlife benefits enormously from these, and the bigger and the thicker they are, the better. But who benefits? Well, it has always been the farmer and everybody that depends on the farmer, which is everybody. And who's going to benefit in future from these still being there in a context where we need perhaps more shade for stock in future, where we need the insects to pollinate the crops that we're going to need to grow in the future, and so on and so forth. The important thing is the time depth here. This is a landscape, and these exemplify it. This is a landscape that, on the whole, has seen an enormous amount of evolution and comparatively little revolution. If you compare us with Ireland or with much of France or Germany, look at what in the academic jargon they talk about as the time depth of features in the landscape, from boundaries of all sorts through to functional things like this. It's a very old landscape, and the logic that created it held in place until the middle of the 20th century. And we can move on maybe to another example, and hopefully you're picking out, I can't remember, there's 8 chapters in the book looking at 8 different features of the landscape that together paint a picture of how the whole landscape has worked, both for people in terms of agriculture primarily, and for wildlife. And I'm just picking out a few of them now. There's no time to go through all of them. I kept this to last. I will draw things to a close soon, but this is my favourite, obviously. Perllan means orchard. But what I decided to do was not to kind of tell the tale again of apple orchards in Wales. And this is the area of Wales where they've survived best of all, but they used to be widespread in lowland Wales, to the point, this is worth saying, if you know the southwest at all, you'll know that you can travel through the whole of southwest Wales without seeing a single orchard. But within living memory, people from Swansea, widespread across lowland Wales. But in this book, I didn't want to go after the apples, because I've done that before. I wanted to go after the pears. And that is actually the root of the Welsh word perllan. Another bit of etymology for you. Llan, as in all the llans in Wales, means an enclosure. That is originally where it comes from. And so a perllan is an enclosure for pears. Pear is one of the three Welsh words for pear, gellig being another one, and rhwning being the last. Nobody uses rhwning anymore, but that's another story. So these are formerly widespread. And it's just worth making the point that I think will be obvious to some people in the room, and maybe new to others. If you look at, for instance, the tithe maps of the 1840s, they give you, from many, many, many parts of the country, they give you the field name, usually in Welsh, even around here, the land use at the time, as well as who the tenant was and who the owner of the land was, if they're not the same person, which often they weren't. And in these perllanau, in these orchards, the land use is often given as pasture, right? It's not a controversial thing, but in a traditional orchard setting, the land is grazed. That conflict between grazing animals and fruit production simply didn't exist. It was obvious that whether it's fowls, geese, or whatever, or larger stock, that there are multiple uses to the same patch of land. Now, probably this area is the area of Wales where there's least need for me to say that. But it is maybe an important point, because what is true of fruit production can also be true of many other uses of tree. Some of you will be familiar with the term agroforestry and the promise that holds for the future. And of course, the other thing is that these completely human features of the landscape, to the extent that we still have them, this one is just down the road. Some of you maybe know the people who live there, but I'm not going to mention it because they don't want me to. But this one is just down the road. And these completely man-made. I mean, the apple, the domestic apple, has come from Kazakhstan. It's a completely human cultural adventure as to how it's got here. But we have many native varieties. We've got a couple of dozen native Welsh varieties, and then when you add in all the English varieties, we're running into the thousands. And these man-made features of the land are some of the most uniquely propitious for wildlife of all sorts that we have in this temperate climate. I can't exaggerate that. I mean, there's a fantastic book, if you want to find out more on that, by, what's his name, Benedict MacDonald, called Orchard, A Year in England's Eden, and he follows an orchard in Worcestershire over the course of a year, and it's fantastic. Now, the problem is that the skills, if we wanted this again, we've almost entirely lost the skills. and I can hardly exaggerate this. This is being recorded, so I shouldn't say this, so you'll have to edit it out, but I'm going to say it anyway. The National Botanic Gardens of Wales, fantastic place, they're doing fantastic work there. I helped set up the orchard of national, heritage Welsh varieties there. The gardening team didn't know how to graft. This is the National Botanic Gardens. Basic skills, let alone, where's the fruit going to go? Who knows how to work with apples these days? Very, very few people. Apple trees, the skills, the March Apple Network, another fantastic organization based locally, they're probably folding because the people are not coming through. This is highly relevant to the future. Many of these varieties will do well in adverse circumstances, in organic production, and so on and so forth, that modern varieties won't. But we're losing the skills. So I think that's a good point at which to segue into the end. We're losing the skills. If people ask me, I'm a naturalist, I talk on, Radio Cymru has a weekly nature programme. It's been going on for years. I'm on it, I'm a panellist. My first love was animals. I'm a naturalist. But when people ask me about, do you support the farmers? Of course I do. Of course I do. We need them. Absolutely we need them. We need the small farms. We need those skills. There is no countryside without them. So why does this matter? Why does understanding the logic that's shaped the Welsh landscape, and we've only touched on a few examples of this tonight, there's much more in the book. Why does it matter? It matters because this landscape developed the structure it developed through and with farming systems that fed people without fossil fuels. Now, I'm not suggesting we go back to farming as it was in the 1950s or as it was in the 1850s. I am suggesting that there's plenty of principles underlying that sort of farming that we would do well to learn from, and that many really inspirational farmers are learning from right now and making better returns from it. That's important for everybody in society, farmer or not, country dweller or not, in my humble opinion. It also matters because of this thing that I touched on at the beginning that's much more on in the book, about knowing place. The landscape, the features of the landscape that we have, that we had in Wales and still have to some extent, are not where they are by accident. Sorry, they're not where they are by accident. They're there as a function of people who knew the land intimately. The woods are where the woods are, not because people could be bothered or hadn't got around to denuding it and chopping them down. The woods have had an economic function for 5,000 years. That is the only reason we have ancient woodland here. It's because of the economic function for people in a woodland economy that we've now lost. Things like clog making. Talk to me about that afterwards. But knowing place, and that's been embedded in a culture. And yeah, anyway, I could go on about that. But and this, I think, is important to the future because sometimes all of these questions and debates and so on are approached as though we had the liberty of a blank slate. Well, it's actually a very good thing that we don't. The land is not a blank slate, and how we approach the future should, in my opinion, and this is also a deeply conservative point to make, incidentally, how we approach the future should acknowledge the depth to which the land is not a blank slate here. I expound in the very final pages of the book in what I hope is a hopeful way, what the Towey Valley in an optimistic scenario could look like, the lower Towey Valley in the 2080s. A lot has, I'm not going to read it now, but a lot has changed. There are crops, there are species there that have never been there before because the climate has gone a little bit haywire, and that's not a good thing. However, there's still cattle, There's still the old hedgerows. What's the point of getting rid of them? We've got to work with them. Ash trees, thankfully, are still just about there, though they're only there on the very north-facing slopes, and so on and so forth. Much will inevitably change, but how well that change happens is still up for grabs. And I think understanding where we've come from on all these different levels, social, cultural, and ecological, is immensely important to approaching them. I could make more political points at this point. I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to say I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and your comments. I also am going to say that this is out today. And I wanted to just get this in because it's just so nice. I was told the other day very kindly by John Gower to remind you all that there's only 230 or so shopping days left till Christmas.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carwyn. I found that very inspiring, very informative, and hugely edifying, actually, for underpinning a lot of the ideas and the ambitions and the values of Black Mountains College. You mentioned skills, you ended on skills, which is our starting point, particularly coppicing, shout out to Jed, and the reinvention of that 5,000-year-old woodland economy, which is what we are trying to kickstart here. And horticulture, Rashid, the growing of the apples, together with the integration of that in integrated systems, the cycling of nutrients, and in our degree programme looking at understanding the past in order to inform the future. The grammar, I'm so pleased that my children are in a Welsh-speaking school because the grammar of that future, our necessary future, is there in the language. And if we want to talk about decolonising the curriculum, which is a very trendy topic in universities, the best place to start is in the first colony, here, to actually think about the processes that you've talked about in terms of the industrialisation. That first step was across the border, across Offa's Dyke, into this country. So that history, that is intimately linked to the future that we're trying to inquire about and inspire other people to think about here. So I don't have any questions myself. I don't want to take up the time.
Questions or comments? Okay, there's several. Ben can...
I wondered in your book, coming from tier and the meaning of tier, do you address the aspect of scale of farming and how you have to actually enclose or open our space and the scale of farming?
Yeah, you mean the fact that farming has got to a place where you have to get big or get out?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, throughout, but like sort of tangentially at many, many different points. What I'd say to that is tell you very briefly about a meeting I had 2 days ago with two old boys from the Towy Valley, again, because it's down the road, both of whom grew up on small farms, both of whom obviously absolutely supported the farmers' protests that has been going on, both of whom wanted to tell me how ridiculous it is that in their day you could have a milking herd in those parts of 20 cows and be completely economically viable. And if you had 50, you were big. And these days you can have several hundred and you can't make ends meet. That's not an original thing to say. But I suppose to dig a little bit deeper, what I would say is that if we think about decades to come, which is the right time scale, and we think about food security, which every single audience I've ever spoken to agrees that that's a big issue, but government doesn't agree. So now I am being political. Then we need a lot more horticulture. Horticulture takes labour, it takes people to do it, and it also takes, it takes that, that sort of cycling system. There's a farm that's quoted in the book that I visit. It's a 30-acre farm. There's 6 people working that 30-acre farm full time. They have livestock. Why do they have livestock? Because they're a horticulture outfit. And the longer they do it, the more they realise they need livestock. And they're a 30-acre farm on poor soils, but they employ 6 people. There's something there that I think that our politicians and the conversation about all this really needs to hear. So yes, more farms, smaller farms. I will go on Radio Cymru and I will say the thing that sounds ridiculous, which is I don't think we should be aiming to keep farmers farming as a policy aim. I think we should be aiming to have more farmers.
You started talking about, at the very start, you talked about the polarisation of this issue, so the idea that kind of ecologists, or those that want to rewild the land, or those that want to, I guess, use the land to fight climate change, is in some way polarised or is against farming and farmers. I wondered if you could kind of talk about that a little bit more, which I suppose through your talk, the way that the land was kind of used or engaged with previously, it didn't have or require a kind of conscious need to fight climate or to sequester carbon. That was there as a byproduct. And which side of that debate kind of goes back to how you'd like to see?
So a couple of things, I hope this makes sense. First thing is I reject the terms of the debate. So there's no side of the debate, because I reject, The second thing is that if you drill into the detail of this, there's absolutely a whole load of very good science behind rewilding. It's in no sense an anti-rewilding book, nor is it a pro-rewilding book. But if you drill into the detail, we have a situation, I think it's fairly, again, ecologically uncontroversial, to say that in a lot of the Welsh uplands, they're suffering ecologically both from overgrazing and undergrazing simultaneously. So where previously you would have, some of this is to do with timing, but a lot of it's to do with the species mix as well. So, the simplistic thing is cattle and sheep, and how a lot of the uplands are now only grazed by sheep. And if you had cattle on there as well, you'd have much more dynamic, at the right stocking density as well, and at the right times of year. There's lots of things you could hedge around that ecologically. But you'd have very different outcomes. But here's the thing. A lot of that, as it's propounded, Bradnashire Wildlife Trust is doing good work on this, actually gets you to a place with very similar patterns of grazing to what you had historically by default, as you alluded to. Does that make sense? So what some people on the rewilding side are, sort of not a strong form of rewilding has carnivores. A slightly weaker form of rewilding gets rid of carnivores, but says you can still imitate carnivores by having us fulfill their function by keeping stock levels, in check. That form of rewilding, where people are developing it now, they end up recreating grazing systems that are more or less the same as what we had here anyway, historically. The question then is how you make that work economically for farming with fewer livestock that don't produce as much meat or as much whatever. Is that doable? I would hope it is. So that's some of the detail there.
It seems to me that the real problem is what you need is people to do these things. I live in a
farming area in East Paris
Yeah.
where one man or two men will
Yeah.
run a farm which
Yeah.
had a lot of people
Yeah.
in the past.
Yeah.
So they have larger machinery.
Yeah.
They have brutal methods of kind of flailing the trees and
Yeah.
hedges and all the rest of it. A lot of ryegrass, monocrop,
Yeah.
stubble turnips.
Yeah.
But if one man's going to run a farm, you know,
Yeah. And
that's how you do it. And we're quite an old audience here, I think. Well, I'm old anyway.
yeah. No, yeah.
Quite a lot of other people are. You know, how many of us have children who've gone into working on the land?
So this is where we need to look at things, you know, you could say to me this is pie in the sky, but I'll just repeat it anyway, because this is where I really strongly think we need to look at things holistically, that sorry word, but what I mean by that is mental health. You know, the very forefront of all the work around mental health says that nature is incredibly good. So hospitals, you know, the forefront of work in hospitals is get patients to see greenery, right? So mental health, right? Mental health, then the food system. 30%, these are official figures, 30% of the NHS backlog and bill is preventable diet-related disease. That's stuff that we know what to do about. And we're wealthy. We are wealthy, but we have a food system that is completely broken. So we need to look at mental health in a way that's not in isolation to the food system in a way that's not in isolation to farming policy and countryside, and then farming policy in the countryside in a way that's not in isolation to ecology. Right now, what Welsh Government are trying to do, they're trying to look at the last two together, but they're flat out refusing to look at the food system, and they've probably got very little clue about the mental health side of things. But if you look at the four things holistically, there's enormous, you know, follow the money, there's enormous savings to be made to the public purse. But it would take policy making of a type that has not been, there's simply not existed, to my knowledge, in the West. But is it worth making the case and trying to get to the point where people are encouraged and it's possible again? I think it is, because I think the benefits, the prize, if you like, socially, culturally, and economically, health-wise, you know, all these things, spiritually, is significant. That's the understatement.
Just to sort of lead on from your point, I work in a rural school with a large farming community.
Yeah.
The children are desperate to work on farms.
Yeah.
But there isn't the funding to support all of them to work on their parents' farm. It usually comes down to one.
Yeah.
The rest end up having to compromise and go into trades and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real need for the policy making to encourage and support our young people who are absolutely desperate to work in farming, to keep them there and to develop the next generation of farmers so that we can see our landscape thriving.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm not going to add to that.
Diolch Carwyn, am diddorol observation, I think. I remember many years ago when I picked up Hoskins, The Making of the English Landscape, and how influential that was in my future career path. And I just wonder how you see this book influencing future generations, and whether there's a role for books like this in schools under the history banner.
Yeah, it's, I mean, the book is just it's hopefully just a conversation starter. It's hopefully many better people will pick up and develop all sorts of things. What I see, and the same was true with Welsh food stories, is that we have, this is again, well, it's just what I see. I did a talk last night on food in Cardigan, Aberteifi, with the Cymdeithas Ddiwylliadol Capel Mair, the Capel Mair Annibynwyr Chapel Literary Society. Almost as many as are here tonight. These chapels are still going strong. That whole audience, you know, I learned things from them about food in Wales and food traditions and dishes, and they all wanted to tell me, which was hilarious actually, looking at it. They wanted to tell me how farming back in the day was, you know, it was mixed and farms produced loads more food and blah, 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 blah. I know. I've just written another book about it. But so here's the thing. I think we have, in Wales, we do have all sorts of people in all sorts of parts of the country. This is not just a rural thing, it's also true in urban areas, where people have a lot of knowledge and skills that is undervalued, and they don't generally see the relevance of those skills. We'll lose that to a great extent over the next 20, 25 years, but right now it's still there. And I think the big trick will be if we can carry on the work of culture, which is always passing on to the next generation what they need to know. And there's things about food and about farming and about nature as well, and about, you know, this whole thing about living in a place. So there's an attempt there, isn't there, with the new curriculum? They've put the word Cynefin into it. I think that's really well-intentioned, and it's a good starting point. But we desperately need to join up all the dots in all the ways. So I guess I'm just saying I agree with you.
Okay, do you have time for one more, or I will ask us all to say thanks to Carwyn. Thank you so much. Please join me in welcoming.